All right, jumping right into it, you sent over some interesting research about male pattern baldness,
Mm-hmm.
or as the scientists like to call it, androgenetic alopecia.
Right.
You start noticing some changes up top,
Yeah.
and you can't help but think, oh, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah.
But it turns out this isn't just about hair.
Yeah.
It's really about how guys deal with it mentally, the psychology of it all,
Absolutely.
and even how it affects their decisions on treatments and stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much psychology is tied into something that, from a purely medical perspective, isn't a disease.
Exactly.
Great.
So before we dive into the psychology of it all,
Okay.
could you give us a quick rundown of what's actually happening at a biological level?
Sure. So it really comes down to your genes and how sensitive they are to a hormone called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT.
Okay.
And essentially, DHT shrinks those hair follicles on your scalp,
Got it.
leading to thinner and shorter hair over time. You can almost imagine like a garden hose that's slowly losing water pressure. Kind of what's happening to those hair follicles.
I see. And this isn't some rare thing, is it?
Not at all. It's actually incredibly common.
Wow.
There's even a scale, the Norwood-Hamilton scale,
Mm-hmm.
that doctors use to measure the extent of hair loss.
Okay.
And it ranges from a full head of hair
Uh-huh.
to, well, let's just say significantly less hair.
Yeah. So once you start moving down that scale,
Right.
is there any going back? Can those treatments that we talked about earlier fully reverse the process?
So unfortunately, there's no magic bullet for complete restoration.
Okay.
Medications like minoxidil and finasteride can help slow down the process and maybe even regrow some hair.
Right.
And then there's hair transplantation, which is essentially moving hair follicles from one area to another.
Okay.
But none of these options can magically bring back all the lost hair, especially if you're already quite far down that scale we were talking about.
It's more about managing it than curing it.
Precisely. And this is where the psychology really comes into play.
Right.
Even though androgenetic alopecia isn't a disease in the traditional sense, this study really highlights how much it can affect a man's mental well-being.
Yeah. And the study you sent over,
Mm-hmm.
it really dives deep into that, right?
It does.
What were some of the anxieties that the men in this study were experiencing?
A lot of them talked about feeling older than they actually were, feeling less attractive,
Mhm.
and worrying about disadvantages in their personal and professional lives.
Wow.
Some even feared being stereotyped as less capable
Really?
just because of their hair loss.
It's amazing how much of our identity gets wrapped up in something like hair. You'd think in this day and age we'd be past that.
It's deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
And the study even found that younger men
Mm-hmm.
might be more susceptible to distress from hair loss.
Interesting.
Think about it. Hair loss is often associated with aging.
Right.
So when it happens earlier than expected, it can really mess with your self-image.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So how do men cope with these feelings? What does the study say about that?
Well, the researchers identified 3 main coping mechanisms:
Okay.
compensation, avoidance, and acceptance.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure.
What does compensation look like in this context?
So it's all about trying to redirect attention away from the hair loss.
Got it.
Some guys hit the gym, hoping to make up for it with a great physique.
Yeah.
Others become really meticulous about styling their remaining hair.
Okay.
And some even invest in a killer wardrobe, projecting an image of success and confidence.
I see.
It's almost like overcompensating for a perceived flaw by excelling in other areas.
It's almost like they're trying to build this, external armor to protect themselves from feeling insecure, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay, and then there's avoidance.
Right, which, as the name suggests, is all about avoiding anything that reminds them of their hair loss.
Okay.
The study mentions things like dodging mirrors, refusing to look at photos,
Wow.
or actively suppressing thoughts about their hair.
That sounds exhausting.
It is.
Trying to pretend a problem doesn't exist rarely works out, does it?
Not usually.
All right, and then we have acceptance.
Right, and this is about reframing hair loss as a natural part of life.
Okay.
Some guys in the study saw it as a sign of maturity,
Okay.
or even embraced their new look, seeing it as a unique feature.
So instead of fighting it, they're kind of making peace with it
Right,
and incorporating it into who they are.
that's the key.
Got it.
And what's really interesting is how these different coping mechanisms link to feelings of distress, especially as hair loss progresses.
Okay, this is what I've been waiting for.
Right.
What did this study find? Which coping styles seem to work best?
Well, the results were pretty clear. Acceptance, especially in those with more advanced hair loss, was linked to significantly lower levels of distress.
Interesting.
It seems like embracing the change rather than constantly battling it might be the path to inner peace.
It makes you wonder if the fight against hair loss is actually causing more anxiety than the hair loss itself?
It's a thought-provoking finding for sure,
Yeah.
and it makes you question the effectiveness of the other approaches.
So what about compensation? Did the guys who were hitting the gym and focusing on other aspects of their appearance still feel distressed about their hair?
The study suggests that while compensation might offer a temporary boost,
Okay.
it might not fully address that underlying insecurity. You could have a six-pack and a killer wardrobe, but if you're still fixated on your hair loss,
Yeah.
that anxiety might linger.
It's like trying to cover up a crack in the foundation.
Yeah,
The house might look good on the outside, but that underlying issue is still there.
precisely.
All right. And when it comes to avoidance,
Yeah.
well, I can probably guess how that turned out. I'm
Yeah.
guessing ignoring the issue didn't exactly lead to bliss.
You're right. The study found a direct link between avoidance and lower self-esteem.
Interesting.
Trying to bury your head in the sand, so to speak, just doesn't work.
Yeah.
In fact, it might make you feel even worse about yourself.
So it seems like acceptance is the winning strategy here.
It does seem that way.
But how do you actually get there?
Right.
It's one thing to say just accept it, but how do you actually make that mental shift?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And it's something we'll dig into further.
Okay.
But what I find particularly intriguing is how these different coping mechanisms play into a man's decision to seek medical help for hair loss.
Yeah, that's interesting. You'd think the guys who are most distressed about their hair would be the ones running to the doctor.
Yeah.
Maybe they're the ones most proactive about exploring all their options.
You would think so.
So what did the study find there?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Oh, all right, I'm hooked. Let's get into that right after this. Okay, so we were just talking about how this study found some interesting links between how guys cope with hair loss and how likely they are to see a doctor about it.
Exactly. What we found is that the guys who rely heavily on compensation or avoidance actually seem more likely to seek medical consultation.
Huh. That's not what I would have expected.
Right.
Wouldn't the guys who are most at peace with their hair loss be the ones going to the doctor? Maybe they're just more proactive about exploring their options or something.
It's a reasonable assumption, but this study actually suggests the opposite.
Really?
Yeah, it seems that the guys who are most comfortable with their hair loss aren't necessarily rushing to find medical solutions. It's almost like they've made peace with the situation.
Yeah.
And they just don't feel the need for that external validation or a quick fix.
It's almost like acceptance itself reduces the desire for medical intervention. Is that what you're saying?
That's one way to interpret the findings.
Interesting.
And it really challenges our assumptions about how distress drives behavior.
Yeah.
We often assume that the more distressed someone is, the more likely they are to seek help.
Right.
But in this case, it seems like acceptance actually leads to a decrease in that desire for medical intervention.
So are you saying that the guys who are compensating or avoiding their hair loss are actually more distressed?
Well, it's possible.
I don't
Remember
think-
we talked about how compensation might not fully address that underlying insecurity
Yeah.
and avoidance? Well, that's like trying to sweep dust under the rug, you know? It might look clean for a while, but the problem's still there.
So they might be putting on a brave face, but underneath, they're still really struggling.
Exactly. And that struggle might manifest as a desire for a quick medical fix, you know?
Right.
Hoping that a pill or procedure will magically erase their anxieties and boost their self-esteem.
But the guys who have reached a place of acceptance, they're not chasing that elusive miracle cure.
Right.
It's like they've dealt with the root of the issue, not just the symptoms.
Precisely. And that's a really empowering message, I think.
Yeah.
It suggests that finding ways to cultivate acceptance might be just as important, if not more so, than seeking medical interventions.
Yeah, it's about changing your mindset, not just your hairline.
Precisely. And I think that's a crucial takeaway from this study.
Absolutely. So we've covered the science, the psychological impact, the different coping mechanisms. We even talked about how those coping mechanisms influence the decision to seek medical help.
Right.
But the big question remains,
Yeah.
how do you actually cultivate that sense of acceptance when faced with something like hair loss?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's easy to say just accept it,
Right.
but it's got to be a lot harder to actually do.
It's definitely a challenge, and it's not something that happens overnight.
So where do you even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is,
So we were talking about cultivating acceptance when it comes to hair loss.
yeah,
It's one thing to say just accept it, you know?
right.
But how do you actually make that mental shift?
Well, I think it's important to remember that acceptance isn't about giving up
Okay,
or resigning yourself to feeling bad about it.
right.
It's not about pretending that you don't care.
Got it.
It's about shifting your perspective
Yeah.
and finding a way to be okay with what is, with
Right.
who you are right now.
I mean, that sounds great in theory,
Yeah,
but it's got to be tough to put into practice, right?
absolutely.
Especially when we're bombarded with images of like,
Right.
thick, luscious hair being the ultimate standard of attractiveness.
Absolutely. Those societal beauty standards are everywhere,
Yeah.
and they can be incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start is by challenging those standards.
Okay.
Recognize that they're often unrealistic
Yeah.
and, frankly, pretty superficial.
Yeah, it's like we've been programmed to think that hair is like the be-all and end-all of attractiveness.
It is.
But it's just one small part of who we are as people,
Exactly. So ask yourself,
Yeah.
why do we place so much value on hair?
Right.
Is it really that essential to our identity and worth?
Hmm.
Are there other qualities, both internal and external,
Yeah.
that are far more important and defining?
It's about reframing what we consider attractive and recognizing that beauty comes in all shapes and sizes.
Absolutely.
And yes, even levels of hairiness, right?
Right.
We need to celebrate diversity and redefine what it means to be a confident, attractive man.
Couldn't agree more.
So, do you think it would be helpful to find role models?
Absolutely.
People who are embracing their hair loss with confidence and style?
For sure.
It's like, finding your tribe, a community that understands and supports you.
Yeah.
Speaking of support, I imagine having a strong network of friends and family can make a huge difference as well.
It does, absolutely. This study didn't specifically look at support systems,
Okay.
but it makes sense that having people you can talk to who
Mm.
understand what you're going through
Yeah.
would be incredibly helpful.
Right.
Being able to share your struggles and receive encouragement from others can be really validating.
Yeah. It's like that saying, shared joy is doubled, shared sorrow is halved.
Exactly.
Having people to lean on can make the journey so much easier.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the role of therapy or counseling.
Oh,
If you're really struggling with hair loss
Mhm.
and it's impacting your mental health, talking to a professional can be incredibly beneficial.
They can provide tools and strategies for managing anxiety, building self-esteem, and navigating those tricky emotional waters.
Absolutely.
It's not a sign of weakness or anything. It's a
Well.
sign of strength and self-care.
Exactly. It's about seeking support when you need it
Right.
and recognizing that you don't have to go through this alone.
So we've talked about challenging societal standards,
Right.
finding role models, building a support network, and seeking professional help if needed.
Yeah.
Those are all great steps towards cultivating acceptance.
They are.
But there's one more thing I think is crucial, and that's self-compassion.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
It's about being kind to yourself, acknowledging that hair loss can be a difficult experience, and allowing yourself to feel those emotions without judgment.
Right.
It's about recognizing that you're not defined by your hair,
Right.
but you're still worthy and valuable, regardless of how much is on your head.
Right, exactly. And that takes practice.
It does.
It's an ongoing process.
Right.
And there will be days when you feel more confident than others.
Of course.
But the key is to keep coming back to that place of self-acceptance
Yeah.
and reminding yourself that you're okay just as you are.
Well, I think this deep dive has taken us far beyond just the surface of male pattern baldness.
It has.
We've explored the science,
Hmm.
the psychology, and the surprisingly complex world of coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
It's not just about hair loss. It's about self-perception, challenging societal norms,
Right.
and having the courage to embrace who you are.
And what we've learned from this study is that acceptance, while challenging,
Yeah,
is ultimately the most liberating path.
it seems that way.
It's about shifting your focus from what you've lost
Mm.
to what you still have
Yeah,
and recognizing that true confidence comes from within.
that's a powerful message. So for anyone listening who's on their own journey with hair loss,
Mm-hmm.
remember those key takeaways.
Right.
Challenge those unrealistic beauty standards. Build a supportive community.
Yeah.
Be kind to yourself. And never underestimate the power of acceptance.
And who knows, maybe embracing that change rather than fighting it
Yeah.
will lead you to discover a whole new level of confidence and self-love you never thought possible.
That's certainly something to think about. Until next time, keep those brains engaged and remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to understanding ourselves and the world around us.
Couldn't agree more.
See you on the next Deep Dive.